Big story. Undeterred by the bloodiest day of protest on Friday when two demonstrators were gunned down, the opponents of military coup in Myanmar have called for a nationwide strike today. The call for a general strike was made on Sunday by the civil disobedience movement, a group leading resistance to the army's takeover of power in their country. This call for general strike has prompted a response from Myanmar military leadership. The military has come forward to issue a thinly veiled threat to use lethal force if these protests continue. In fact, I'd like to read a statement by the Myanmar military leadership. It says, protesters, I quote, it says, protesters are now inciting the people, especially emotional teenagers and youth, to a confrontation path where they will suffer the loss of life. Quote, they will suffer the loss of life. Now, this has been considered as a threat by the military leaders to the demonstrators. Another part of the statement blamed protesters for inciting violence and justified the military action against them. Myanmar state television broadcaster MRTV late carried this public announcement from the military leadership, which is now formally called the State Administration Council. The announcement sounded more like a stern warning to curb dissent. Meanwhile, a large crowd has gathered again at the Hledan Center in Yangon, with protesters carrying photos of detained leader Suu Kyi and the demonstrators chanting and raising slogans against the military. As you can see from these visuals, hundreds of thousands of people are out on the streets of Myanmar, and this protest has now spread to virtually every part of the country. Tens of thousands of people marched in Dawei in southern Myanmar on Monday, answering a call for a general strike. A massive civil disobedience movement, which has not been seen in recent times, has choked and paralyzed all government operations and businesses in the city. Citizens of Mandalay have also refused to back down. Protesters flocked to the streets despite a chilling message from the military leadership of Myanmar. Now, the day of 22nd February holds significance for a country which considers some dates as auspicious. Protesters have compared this day to demonstrations on the 8th of August 1988, when a previous generation staged anti-military protests which were bloodily suppressed. Angered with the use of force by the police, hundreds gathered outside the US Embassy in Yangon to hold the candlelight vigil for those who lost their lives during these demonstrations. Meanwhile, a funeral was held for the 20-year-old girl who was shot in the head by police while the authorities were trying to quell the protests. Hundreds of people packed into a crematorium in the capital, Naypyidaw, as mourners carried in the coffin containing her body. When her body was released, a long motorized procession began a drive to the cemetery, where thousands gathered to pay their respects and raise their voice against the military coup in their country. Joining us on this broadcast now is journalist Dave Grunbaum, and he's joining us live from Kuala Lumpur. Dave, we've been seeing these visuals coming in from Myanmar. It was the bloodiest day of protest just a couple of days back. Two protesters were shot by the authorities. Hundreds of thousands of people are once again out on the streets of Myanmar today. Now, in addition to demonstrations, there have been calls for a nationwide strike today. How widespread does it seem to be?
This nationwide strike seems to be very widespread across the country. It has a lot of momentum. A lot of the largest retailers are closed down, including the largest supermarket chain in the country, City Mart, closed down. A lot of restaurant chains, both domestic and foreign brands, closed down. Food delivery services stopped, and a lot of mom and pop shops have closed too. And then, like you said, when you look at the streets and you look at the number of demonstrators, if you look across the country, this may turn out to be the largest number of demonstrators out on the streets so far, and the protests even before today had massive numbers. It's really just incredible how united these people are, despite the bloody crackdown that led to 2 deaths on Saturday. The young woman who died last week in Naypyidaw. These people, they are motivated. The only thing the generals have done so far is unite the public against them.
Now, last night, the military sent a warning about the protests. And they said the protests could lead to a path that could lead to loss of life. Now, this message seems very clear, doesn't it? It's a clear warning that the leadership, military leadership, is not afraid of using lethal force to quell the dissent.
There's nothing ambiguous about this message. It's a very clear threat about deadly force. Now, they've used it in a couple isolated incidents so far, but they have not used it in this particular case against massive numbers of protests yet. But every demonstrator out there is keenly aware that in 1988, 2007, and other times, the military did gun down large numbers of protesters. They certainly know that they're capable of doing that again. The question here is, where is the military's line this time? When would they go to deadly force? They clearly do not have control over the country right now. So when would they decide that the only way for them to establish control is to result to gunning down massive numbers of demonstrators? The thing they're considering, though, the generals, is unlike 1988 and 2007, the world is much more connected now. And they're not going to be able to hide it for long. They're not going to be able to keep that video and that information from getting out for long. It's going to spread quickly. So the generals have got a difficult calculation they would have to make if they were to go that route.
Now, the large-scale protests have been going on every day for more than 2 weeks now. Is there a way out of this standoff?
The longer it goes on, the harder it seems that we could see a peaceful resolution to this. On one side, you've got the generals who have spent their entire adult lives in the very insular world of the Myanmar army. It's just about all they know. On the other side, you've got these demonstrators that are incredibly united. They got a taste of democracy these last few years. They've seen benefits to their economy, and they don't want to go back to the type of economy that was run by the military, and the military ran it into the ground over a 50-year period. The public does not want to go back to that. But on the flip side, a lot of people in this country have not been working since early this month. And we're less than a week away from the end of the month. So when these people don't get paid at the end of February and we get into March and the situation is still in the same situation it is now, we still have the status quo, a lot of these people are going to have to ask themselves, are they going to be able to go another month without pay? They still got to feed their children. So for some people, there could be a real gut check next week.
Dave, one final question before I let you go. You know, the world is seeing these visuals coming out of Myanmar. Almost every city in Myanmar, thousands of people are out on the streets. The United Nations has warned Myanmar's military leadership against using lethal force against the demonstrators and the protesters. Students, teachers are out on the streets against the military. Is there scope for international intervention in Myanmar?
I mean, here's the thing. There have been strong words coming from the West. That's not going to change the generals' calculations, really. They were expecting that. If you could get some Asian countries that have leverage over Myanmar, such as China or some Southeast Asian countries, to really apply more leverage, when it comes to the words and discussions, that could have some impact. But right now, none of the countries that seem to have any leverage and sway within Myanmar seem to be willing to push the generals to reverse the coup. They're saying don't use violence. They're saying release Aung San Suu Kyi. But as far as reversing the coup, we don't see that coming from any countries that have any sort of leverage or influence with Myanmar.
Dave Grunbaum, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your views on this developing story.